You're listening to the Bloodshed Baddies. Hi, I'm Lex.
I'm Sam.
I'm Brian.
And I'm Cameron.
And we are the Bloodshed Baddies.
Woo!
Baddies, we have a special treat for you today. We have our first ever special guest on the pod, and they are a baddie brother duo who have written a whole book about a wild case. Their book is called Murder on Campus, and it's about the murder of Virginia Marie Olson.
To start out, why don't you guys tell us a little bit about yourself and your book and all that?
Yeah, so I'm a university English professor, and I actually came to this book, the story of Ginger Olson's murder, in 1999. So I was a student at the University of North Carolina, Asheville in 1999. And in another lifetime ago, I was a drama student. And so I was,
Oh,
yeah. So that was something I had in common with Virginia Olson. So like me, Virginia Olson was this young girl who had kind of recently moved to North Carolina. She went off to college. And she was just finishing her first year and a half at UNCA at the time she was murdered. And when I came to UNCA in 1999, I found myself the very first day of classes, kind of standing in the lobby of our school's main theater. And I was waiting for the classes to get out. And if you all remember that time when you're like that moment when you're in college and you don't really know anyone yet. And so you just have those times where you're like just trying to busy yourself and just kind of look around like
yes.
For a
you don't
time
want
like you
anyone to
know what you're
bother you.
doing.
You're not, you know what you're doing, that type of thing. And so that's what I was doing in the lobby, and I found myself in front of this portrait of this woman holding a paintbrush, and you see it's on the cover of our book, and that's Virginia Olson. And an upperclassman came out of the classroom that was getting out, and he came up to me and he said, "Oh, that's Virginia Olson right there. She was a student here a long time ago, and she died." And so I thought, okay, and that was interesting, kind of trivia, fun fact. And I didn't really think about it too much more that day. But later that year, someone came up to me when I was near the portrait again and say, Have you heard the story about Virginia Olson? She was this drama student here and she was murdered in the theater." And so I thought that
Ooh.
was really creepy. And it was one of those things that every theater has like ghost stories and stuff. And I felt
Yes.
myself in the theater and I feel like really creeped out because this student, like me, had been murdered there. And then another student came up to me later and said, actually, all those people had it wrong. She did die. She was a student here in the 1990s, but she was actually raped and murdered in the botanical
Ooh.
gardens that were adjacent to campus. And so I never really got a straight version of the story when I was at UNCA. And even though there were professors at the school when I was there who had been students and peers of Virginia Olson's, it seemed like it was one of those things that was a campus ghost story, but people didn't really talk about it. So her name was familiar, but no one really knew what happened. But it made a deep impression on me because my very first day in college, part of the way I kind of thought about it was like my first day was also learning about this other UNCA student who, like me, was studying drama, who didn't have the opportunity to really finish or even grow up. So it made a really deep impression. And as I went on to graduate school and did other things, I never forgot about this case, and I would periodically do some light research as I was becoming a researcher myself and try to learn about like what was said about the case originally and what that coverage looked like. And I would periodically check if there were any updates to the case, and there weren't for long stretches. I eventually found myself teaching this like creative writing class that was focused towards true crime in college. It was a college seminar, and that was really at the point when a student had asked me, like, so, what's the case that you really care about, that you would really love to write about? And I had written other articles and stuff, but I had never written a full book that was focused on a single case. And this was the one that was really obvious to me. And my kind of interest in this case, really kind of in wanting to get started in this case, kind of paralleled a lot of things that were happening with Cameron. And that's kind of where Cameron came into the whole story and where this project really started.
Yeah, so I entered the Raleigh Police Academy back in 2005, and I was working in, they call it field ops, but answering 911 calls and whatnot in Southeast Raleigh, which was in Raleigh, the most proactive place to be. It's where all the fun is.
Hmm.
And so I just started my marriage number two, like most cops do. And then I had my second child, my daughter, and my daughter ended up having some health problems where we end up spending 98 days at Duke Children's in the NICU.
Oh
And so it
no.
made me really start to reevaluate what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. Am I really going to do 30 years and retire? So I took a position as a school resource officer at a high school with the same department. And I was enjoying that. But like most things with the riots and with COVID, they really started to mess with my schedule. And it just was not a good family fit at all. I mean, I was honestly barely sleeping some days. And so my wife and I talked and we thought it'd be best to step away. I found a department near here, near Raleigh, that would allow me to work just whenever I wanted to come in, essentially. And there's zero crime in that town too, so it was completely different than, what I was doing. But that really didn't satisfy that itch. So Brian started to call me about the true crimes class, and he had tell me about the cases, and then we'd start bantering back and forth about them and start researching them together. And that ended up turning into kind of like these nightly phone calls where we would discuss these cases. And then one day, Brian called me and said, "Hey, I've got this case I'd like for us to do. And, maybe it'll be an article, maybe it'll be a book." I really didn't put that much thought into it. I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. So, long story short, I start, looking into it, just reading some articles. And the next day he calls me. He's like, "Hey, we're under contract for a book deal.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah, so here's the schedule where we have to have everything done." So it was one of those moments where I was like, shit, I didn't see that coming. But at the same time, it was really good to get back into the action and do something meaningful.
That's great. So, can you tell us a little bit about Virginia's case? And I know you guys have talked about how many twists and turns this case took. So, if you could give us like a brief overview of everything, if you could.
Sure. Why don't we start at the place where, the way the book is structured, we can tell your listeners. So we kind of talk a little bit about ourselves in the first few chapters. One of the things that we did through our research, we kind of recreate the original investigation into Virginia Olson's death. And it's divided into basically three major sections. She's murdered on April 15th, 1973. So we wanted to help everyone understand what that first 8 months of the investigation looked like between 73 and 74. In 74, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation is going to get really involved, and we could talk about that. And the case eventually is going to go cold around 1986. So we chart what happened in the investigation and why it happened. And then during the last part of the book, Cameron and I, because we have different backgrounds and different skill sets, we take a lot of the theories that have existed about the case, both ones from the original investigators, but also theories from other suspects that we think should be considered. And we each take our different skills and really kind of focus and try to kind of press on those different theories and see what our different thoughts are and invite the reader to participate in that discussion with us. But where this really starts, I guess, is on the day that she is murdered. So she is murdered on April 15th, 1973. She's a student at UNC Asheville. And so do you all have a sense of Asheville at all? Asheville, North
I
Carolina?
love
Aside from just the
Asheville.
Hurricane Helen? Oh, you do?
Yes.
So you've been to Asheville. Okay.
Yes, I've been there a couple times.
Okay, so the times you've been there, you probably think of like Asheville as this like cultural hub. It's like artsy and like free thinkers
Yes.
and okay, kind of hippie-ish. So that's kind of the way it was in 1973. It was just a smaller population. The population in 53 was half of what it was, or
Oh
73 is
wow.
half of what it was today. It was about 49,000, 50,000 people in 1973. UNC Asheville was really attractive to a lot of people for the same reasons like you described, like you liked it, like it was kind of like people that were artists and were kind of thought of themselves as different and otherwise fairly conservative region of the state were attracted to go there. And that was Virginia Olson. And so the day she's murdered, she had just recently come back from spring break and she had spent that with her boyfriend. And she arrived back to UNC Asheville's campus on Friday the 13th, right? A fairly
Oh.
ominous date for those of us that are horror
Oh.
fans. But it didn't feel that way to her. And so she walks into her dorm and actually tells her roommate, a friend named Jane Nicholson, she said, I actually love Friday the 13th, but something good always happens to me on Friday the 13th. And those weren't her famous last words. I saw Sam grimace just a little bit.
Oh, good.
But she ends up discovering on Friday the 13th that her parents, who lived about a little less than 3 hours from her, were going to be traveling through the area en route to a vacation in Missouri. And they were going to stop by and see her. So she was really excited about this because she had spent a lot of spring break with her boyfriend and was really was very close to her family. The Sunday she's murdered, she had lunch with her roommate in the dining hall. They got back to the dorm, and she was worried about some final exams, like many students are at the very end of the semester, and decided she would go to the nearby Biltmore Botanical Gardens. The Biltmore Botanical Gardens are a set of gardens that are basically adjacent to UNCA's campus, and it's an area that students like to go. The public use it too. It's about 50 acres of just trails, beautiful mountains, and kind of scenic areas where you can kind of sit and be outdoors. And this was a beautiful day. It had been a cold week, and this was unseasonably warm April day. And so she grabs her book, speaks to some classmates, and says, she's going to the botanical gardens to study for a Spanish exam she's concerned about. Her friends see her kind of crossing the street about 12:45 towards the botanical gardens, and according to the search warrant affidavits that we include in the book, we have witnesses that spot her walking into the botanical gardens at 1 o'clock. By 1:15, kind of walking you through the timeline that we know, by 1:15, she has settled into a spot that is slightly off one of the main trails. It's more secluded. It was locally known as a place where winos, but also a kind of lover's lane for like high school kids, where they would go. It's close to the area where a lot of people were out and about for the day. There were about 100 people in this 50-acre park that
Wow.
day. And
Wow.
so it's slightly more secluded, but it's not an obscure spot. And so she's sitting near a rock area studying, and a witness spots her sitting conversing with a man at 1:15. When that same witness passes back through 30 minutes later at 1:45, she's no longer there. And he sees something flapping in the wind that we would later learn was her textbooks. At 3:30, there's a gap now in the timeline, but at 3:30, some high school students, one who was 14 years old and one who was 17, who were camping, or they were having a weenie roast, is the way they described it in the police reports, but they were with some friends, like cooking hot dogs and stuff. They were passing by on the trail, and they just come across a horrific scene. And it's Virginia Olson, and her shirt has been shredded. She's been bound. She's been gagged with her shirt. There is a lot of blood everywhere. There's about 3 liters of blood that is in the area around her, and she has been stabbed in the heart, and her throat has been cut. And it scares the hell out of the boys, as you can imagine. They run out of the park. The police are called, and that begins an investigation that's going to span 51 years. And that's kind of where all of this begins. Cameron, I think, is really good at speaking from a kind of law enforcement perspective about that crime scene. So the boys find Virginia Olson there, the police are called, and the police arrive. And I don't know, Cameron, maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I think what's important when we look at this is number one, we did include the timeline in our appendix in the book. We feel that it's important that every piece of information that we have is given out to our readers. That way they can form their own opinion. And if they think something is incorrect, we'd love to hear about it. When we look at murder scenes, one of the biggest factors in the investigation is be able to protect the integrity of the scene. And the way that that's done is that after care, if that's viable, is provide for the victim and that the scene is secured, then crime scene tape is placed up. And you want to make that as big as possible to cover the entire crime scene and to have a buffer. If it's a major crime, you actually want to have an inner and outer perimeter. This is a 50-acre piece of land in the mountains, and you've got people that are milling around. We know that the police officers were not wearing gloves when they were carting off her body.
No.
We know that her roommate was able to walk down to the scene after she heard about all the commotion, and she actually shows a picture of Virginia to one of the officers. So we've got those factors, and then we also look at the forensic factors that we would really be gearing towards now, like touch DNA and semen samples. And like Brian said, we know that she was bound, that her shirt was cut, and that her arms, legs, and she was gagged. One things we did is we were talking with the two friends from the medical examiner's department. And also, I called a friend that processes crime scenes. I pitched the case to them and asked them, like, what would you have done? And they were very interested in these bindings because of touch DNA. And we feel that having those removed at the scene by the officers kind of messed that up for us. But it was from what we can tell, it was very chaotic, and it just seemed to be a free for all as far as people walking through. We also know from looking at the medical examiner's report that from the time the investigators got on the ground until her autopsy, it was only 4 hours. And that's 4 hours removing someone from a wooded area. So they really did not spend a lot of time on the crime scene. One of the other things that we noticed, or that you can tell from if you look at the timeline, is that one of the witnesses sees what he believes is a book flapping the pages. Well, when investigators come to the scene, the book is closed and her glasses are placed on top. So today, if that happened, of course, there'd be DNA, there'd be fingerprints, especially on the glasses, because, that's a smooth surface. But back in 1973, they really didn't think about that. And part of the reason for that is in North Carolina, we've got the North Carolina Training and Standards that actually provides a curriculum for sheriff and police officers statewide that's mandated. So every year there's mandated courses. And that started in 1973. So the officers that were arriving, not only are they from a small department, they probably don't have a lot of experience. They really are lacking manpower, even if they knew what to do. But they just don't have the formal training as well to know of what to keep and what's important. And then the other obvious factor is that we're talking about 1973, and I'm sure that DNA and rape kits weren't really on their mind. Rape kits had started, but they were just starting to be used.
Wow, I think what's incredible is how quickly this timeline is, and that it's just like in broad daylight. It's wild.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things
interesting.
that puzzled us is that this happens in the middle of the day. You've got people we can tell from our timeline, they're walking by. There's really if you're 30 minutes to an hour is what I would give it, is our time frame. That's adding some extra time because I'm sure these are estimates that people are giving.
Yeah,
But
and I
an
should tell
hour
you
is
quick.
not a long time.
Yeah. And if you look at the actual police official and timeline, it's even tighter than the generous one Cameron's given. The police timelines, we have about a 30-minute window, this unaccounted
Right.
for.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Wow.
I think that the hour is the more than generous time frame. And what's really interesting is when we looked at one of the great things about this book and why I don't think a lot has been written about it is that when we first saw this case, I was like, okay, I was reading an article. I could tell they did a search warrant. Told Brian, I'll call Buncombe County, which is the county where Asheville is. And you should be able to call the clerk of court's office and request a search warrant or a copy of the search warrant in its public record. So they have to provide it to you. Thought that was just going to be an easy phone call. Brian was going to work on the ME's report. We got the runaround for 4 months on that search warrant.
Yeah.
And eventually we
Wow.
figured out, after talking with Detective Taylor, who's the cold case detective, that they had a copy of the search warrant. But I really believe that they have the only copy in existence. Eventually, after getting the runaround for 4 months, one of the guys in the clerk of court's office just told me, is like, look, be honest with you, we started to destroy things in 1990 that were
Bad
not
answer.
directly attached to a suspect.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so I'm pretty sure that this thing has been destroyed.
And,
Wow, that's
and I feel
Yeah.
like
wild.
an interesting drinking game with our book is actually take a shot every time we reference some document that was destroyed because of like a
Yeah.
retention schedule.
Don't get too drunk, baddies.
Yeah.
So that was the issue. One of Cameron's colleagues, who's an attorney, looked into it for us, and it was like a very big kind of dramatic thing. And we ended up getting it directly from the city of Asheville. The police department wouldn't fulfill it. And then, as he said, I was working on the medical examiner's report. And just so your listeners know, like a lot of times when you're researching true crime or you're researching like a major crime like a murder, they're always like very kind of dramatic, and Cameron describes it as like chaotic, which is something I like, even in the best of circumstances. And one of the things that you can usually count on, though, is the public records, because the public records are those things that are unchanging. They're not going to, people's memories, all sorts of other things can be changing, but the actual documents don't. And so they're usually pretty easy to get. And when I filed for the medical examiner's report, which is typically like a one-page online form through the North Carolina Medical Examiner's website, and you get it, a few days later, they contacted me and they said, we don't have a copy of this because there was this major fire in 1975. And so every autopsy from 1975 and earlier was destroying this fire. And the charred remains were taken to the North Carolina Archives, which is like a warehouse for keeping these documents. And so we kind of dealt with North Carolina Archives, and they didn't have anything that was good enough to send to us. And it makes sense. No police department wants to spend like all their time like fulfilling like records requests. That's not really what they do. But still, like the only two people in the world that had copies of this medical examiner's report were the North Carolina SBI, which gets involved in this case, and we can talk about that, but also the Asheville Police Department. And so they wouldn't give it to us, which blew my mind. And so I ended up talking to Division of Health and Human Services, which oversees the medical examiner's office, and basically begged them to assist us. They ended up contacting Asheville directly because they didn't have a copy of one of their own autopsies in their own records. And so they got a copy of the medical examiner's report, let me file records request with them, and then they hand it back to me. So we play that kind of like musical chairs a little bit. But those are just two examples, and we have like 7 or 8 others we could give of just things that made it almost impossible to get documents with these cases. Because of that, we republished these documents in the book, unredacted. So people's names, addresses in some cases are in there. We wanted everyone to be able to see. Almost all these individuals are deceased now at this point, but there was a reason why we are the first book to ever be about this case. And also, if you Google Virginia Olson, this is also why the only articles you'll ever find really are the Blue Banner. You're not going to find a lot about this case. And so part of our work we felt like was actually just recreating what happened with the investigation because there's a lot of misinformation out there about that.
Wow. So I think my biggest question is obviously like with it being in 73 and the difference in police work and with all these difficulties with records, do you believe this case will be solved in your lifetime?
Brian, do you want to give your theory?
So if you mean like someone will be arrested, absolutely not. Like this case I don't think there's any chance this case will be prosecuted. In terms of like having a pretty strong idea or confirming an existing suspect, yeah, I think it's possible. We look at a few different individuals in this book. So the original investigators had a suspect for over 13 years that they openly said was their main suspect, but they would never name him.
Wow.
Now, the rumor in town was that this individual was from an influential family. And I
Oh,
hadn't thought too much about the search warrant initially. And I thought, that's gossip. I don't put too much stock in that. Let's just file and get the search warrant. And then when Cameron ran into all those issues, it made me even more obsessed with wanting to know the name of this person because we did have the detectives confirm that, yeah, the individual in this search warrant that was served 2 weeks after her death is the same individual that police would kind of cryptically reference for the next decade or so as the person they thought was likely responsible, but they just needed one more piece of evidence. And so when we got the search warrant, and I remember the moment opening it up and just thinking like, okay, that's his name, but who's that? Who is this guy? Who is this guy? Like, it wasn't someone that I'm not sure what I was expecting. But then when we found out who this guy was, there was a lot of stuff that was really surprising about this individual. And this case gets very, very strange really quickly. But I think it's possible that this case could be solved. And the way it'll be solved is it needs word of mouth. It needs people to know about it. So whether the main suspect in this case that the police had was a guy named John Rivas Jr. We talk about him in the book. If any listeners are connected to John Rivas Jr. in Massachusetts or in New Mexico or in California, these places that he had ties to, we would love for them to contact us. Another person we look really closely at is currently sitting on death row, so he's not going anywhere, but his name's Terry Hyatt, and Cameron has a lot of interesting stories about him. He's a serial killer in North Carolina.
Ooh.
He happened to live in the town and was 16 years old at the time this murder was committed, and he's kills women in very similar ways. And one of his victims was actually dumped 2 miles from this crime scene. And so he's someone that we also kind of explore in the book as well. And I think if this case is solved, which is different from it being like prosecuted, I think if it's solved, it's going to be from just people being aware of it. one of the big tragedies of this case is that the case, Virginia Olson's murder occurs the same week that the Watergate trials start nationally. So there's no
Oh
national coverage
no.
really. And then back home, because she's new to North Carolina, she'd only briefly lived in Lexington and basically was just a student at UNCA for most of her just time in North Carolina. So she didn't have a really strong group there. And her friends and people that were back home in McLean, Virginia, where she grew up, two people from her graduating class that were very popular were killed in a car accident the same week that she was murdered. And
Oh
so
my
all the
goodness.
local coverage is about that because she no longer lived there and not lived there in over a year. And so there was all these factors that conspired just for people not to be talking about it. And so we have been trying to talk about it to everyone who will listen and try to get the word out about this case because I don't believe that someone rapes, stabs someone through the heart, cuts their throat post-mortem, which is what happened here, and then they go the rest of their life and they never say anything about to any person, never commit another crime. No one in their orbit has any idea whatsoever that they could be connected to this. I just think it's just the information isn't out there. But most of Virginia Olson's peers are now in their 70s. If the person was older than a college student, they would be in their 80s or 90s now or dead, right? Like the main suspect
Yeah.
is. And so if there's any hope of kind of getting this solved, we think that it's time to really have a really open and transparent conversation about it. And that includes the Asheville Police Department too, if they're happening to be listening.
I agree with you
I love
100%.
that. So we are running out of time, but I think all of our listeners need to go grab your book immediately. So where can our listeners find your book? Where is the best place to find you guys? Go ahead and plug yourselves.
So you can find the book at Barnes& and Noble, also Amazon, Books A Million. You can get at your local bookstore because it's in Ingram, so you just have to request it. You can follow us on social media on Instagram at Santana Brothers True Crime. And you can also follow Brian on X or Twitter at Brian Santana. And we also have another X page, which is Santana Brothers True Crime.
Awesome. I know I'm definitely going to buy the book because I want to read more about the theory. So Baddies, will link it in the show notes. Go follow them, buy the book.
Your listeners have time for one little tidbit to take like 10 seconds. I can tell you
Yes.
that right as after this murder, so if some of the many things that make this case complicated, on the 1 year anniversary of this murder, as the campus is kind of just coming out of this period of mourning and they're starting to think about what's moving on and having Virginia Olson memorial book drives and things, the police descend on a campus because another UNCA student who's very similar to Virginia Olson has been abducted and it throws everything into chaos in town. That story is really insane in the book. And 5 years later, after this first class has graduated, another person is going to be raped and murdered in the exact same spot as Virginia Olson. We talk about that case in detail as well in the book. There is no shortage of strange coincidences that haunt this. And if your readers like rabbit holes, we've got plenty that they can fall into while they're reading the book.
Do you think they're connected?
Well, that's what you all have to read. We're interested in what you all think. Like, I think that there's a lot of different things. Like, there's a lot of coincidences, but you get to a certain point. Like, how many different things can be pure coincidence? But we're interested in hearing what people think that read the book.
Here's a fun fact. Terry's first known murder, he killed her on April 15th. The same, yeah, lots of
Interesting.
coincidences. Yes. And in the same manner of Virginia.
And one final thing to blow your mind, one of the witnesses is on the State Bureau of Investigation's affidavit. She is a self-proclaimed psychic who actually taught briefly at Duke University's parapsychology school, which was one of the few at the time in the mid-20th century, and would later consult on a horror film called Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 3 as making sure there was an authentic depiction of psychics. So there's some strange, interesting kind of characters that pop up throughout this story, and we think that a lot of these kinds of factors are things that haven't been reported and talked about before with this case.
My goodness.
So there's also a mental asylum that's very famous that F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife was burned to death in, and that's just right beside campus as well. And we have a chapter on Highland Hospital in this, and all the rumors
Wow.
surrounding the possible connections to Highland Hospital. It's pretty insane story.
Thank you guys so much. This was so interesting. I'm so excited to buy the book. Thank you for coming on
Yes.
and being our
And
first guests.
Thank you so much.
Well,
You're
thank you
welcome.
for having
thank
us.
you.
Thank
All
you
right.
all. We enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening. Please give us a follow on wherever you are listening and also on Instagram at Bloodshed Baddies. And please, please, please leave us some nice reviews.
Send us an email with a case suggestion. We love them. bloodshedbaddies@gmail.com. Buy our friend's book, which will be linked. And don't forget our intro music is made by our awesome cousin Vinny. And tune in next week for another episode.
Bye bye.